EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. It's a new calendar year, which means it's time to look ahead to what's looming for colleges and universities in 2020. Collin Binkley, who covers higher education for the Associated Press, is here to talk about everything from affordability and access to ways local reporters can dig for important accountability stories. Welcome back, Collin, and how's your new year been so far?
Not a lot to go by, but very good so far. Trying to wrap my head around sort of the big education year that's looming ahead. You know, beyond the election that I know is going to take up a lot of the news, there are a lot of great education stories that will need to be followed, and we're likely to see a lot of storylines from last year continue to bear fruit and really start to play out in interesting ways.
Well, before we jump ahead to what's brand new, let's talk about that. What's being carried over from 2019?
Well, 2019, it's no surprise that one of the biggest storylines was in college admissions. You know, obviously the varsity blues scandal made a lot of headlines, but it also brought to the forefront a lot of interesting questions about how the rules are changing in college admissions and what is fair. And so some of what we saw come out of that will probably start to bear more fruit over this next year. In particular, we're going to see how schools are respond to try to avoid those types of things in the future. But there are several other sort of prongs to that are going to be really interesting to follow. In particular, one that comes to mind for me, again, we saw this start to play out over the last couple months, is a sort of little-known story about the National Association for College Counselors, that they updated their rules in a settlement with the Justice Department in a way that is supposed to increase competition in recruiting for students among colleges, but could have some unforeseen consequences. And so there are some real risks that we're going to be following to see what comes out of that.
Well, let's talk about that group for a moment. So essentially, these are the folks who set the rules. If we were playing a football game, they decide whether or not refs are going to be able to use instant replays or how you're going to recruit students for the football team. But really, this is about who gets to go to college, how they identify those prospective students at high school, what they promise them.
Right. This group had sort of a code of ethics that was meant to promote, a spirit of civility or perhaps cooperation to make sure that schools were respecting one another as they recruit students. And part of that, set limits around what schools could do to recruit students. And some of those have been scaled back now. So, one of the big ones is that in the past, there was a hard deadline past which schools were not really supposed to be recruiting students. That's now gone. So schools can try hard to poach other students up until fall classes start, and they can offer special deals now. There were sort of limits around the types of special perks that schools could offer students, especially for early admission. And now that's also going away. So it'll be really interesting to see what types of deals schools are making and how aggressively they go after students, especially schools that may be hard-pressed to fill their seats as fall classes come around.
And some of these changes were made under direct pressure from the feds. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So this was really done sort of begrudgingly because the Justice Department was going after this, had targeted this in an antitrust lawsuit. They said that these rules essentially unfairly discouraged competition. And so the Justice Department had been investigating, and under pressure, this organization, NACAC, decided voluntarily to rescind a few of these rules from its code of conduct and eventually reached a formal settlement doing so with the Justice Department.
It sounds like a good story for reporters would be to reach out to the admissions officers at their local colleges and universities and just ask, what did you do in 2018 or 19 that you're not going to do in 2020 or 21?
Absolutely. I think that's a story that needs to be told. It's going to be really important to see what schools are doing differently, whether they're going to take advantage of these rules, and if so, which students they're going to try to target, how they're going to do that. One of the big questions is, which students will win out of this change? So there is an idea that with more competition, perhaps some students will get better aid packages. Some school may come to them at the last minute and say, if you come here, we're going to give you this really, really great deal. So that could work out for some students. But there's also a lot of concern that it's just going to increase competition for wealthy students who don't need a lot of aid and students with really good grades who already get the lion's share of attention from schools. So it's going to be important to see how this changes that and what it means for students who might not come from wealthy families or have, test prep in the best grades.
I like this overarching theme that you're talking about here, this idea of fair play in college admissions. And certainly, standardized tests are a piece of that. What's coming or changing in 2020?
This is going to be a really big storyline, I think, over the next year. I think we had seen in 2019 that was called sort of a record year for the number of schools going test optional or dropping requirements for the ACT and SAT. So just simply seeing whether, that continues over 2020 will be interesting. There could be lots more schools. But there's a really big story in California right now that has a lot of potential to make an impact in this debate. The University of California as a system was already reviewing its use of these tests amid some concerns that they may not be fair. There's, for a long time, there have been accusations that these tests work against students from low-income backgrounds. And recently, the University of California system was sued by a coalition of organizations that made just that argument and say that it's unconstitutional because it discriminates. And so, it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in California in particular. We've seen some bigger brand name schools dropping test requirements in the last couple of years, but none, the size of the University of California system. And, if the system did go ahead and decide to go test optional, that would send shockwaves throughout the industry and could set a precedent for others to follow.
We do want to talk a little bit about the 2020 presidential elections. What's on the radars of colleges and universities right now?
The 2020 election is going to be really interesting for colleges. Right now, I think there's been a lot of attention on the Democratic candidates and a lot of the policies that they're proposing, namely around free college and student debt. If a Democrat was to win in 2020, and especially one with sort of the brand of policies like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, that could threaten to really shake up the higher education industry. But there are a lot of other more nuanced aspects of federal regulation that could come from this election. So I think colleges are probably thinking about how to make themselves more affordable, since that has been one of the central criticisms of Democratic presidential candidates and Republicans as well. Both Democrats and Republicans have talked about a student debt crisis. And so there's obviously work at the federal level to try to address that. But schools are also under a lot of pressure themselves to try to sort of rebrand themselves away from the notion that they're sort of becoming unaffordable into the middle class. And also just trying to find a way to regain public trust. There's been all sorts of polling showing that folks across the country have less trust in colleges and universities than perhaps in the past. So that's going to be a big issue.
Do you see colleges and universities as fertile territory, too, for looking at things like the youth vote and ideas about college activism? I mean, certainly in a presidential year, the college Republicans, Democrats, Independent, Green Party, that's when they're recruiting kids, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great idea to look at how candidates are in particular trying to attract college-age voters and young voters, but also the aspect of activism on campus. We're already seeing a push from sort of young Republicans to trying to, there's a sort of, I guess, a new coordinated effort among students who support President Trump. So it'll be interesting to see how some of that reflects what we see in broader society. We've seen, obviously, free speech debates crop up, and we're likely to see more of that as things really start to heat up.
We've talked about some areas where different sides may be butting heads on what's best for higher education, but there have also been some interesting areas of bipartisan agreement. Let's talk a little bit about that.
There are a few areas, I'm thinking specifically about things happening in Washington where there's some agreement that could really lead to some change in the coming year. One of the big ones that's gotten some attention recently is Pell Grants for inmates, for incarcerated people. And that's something that advocates have been pushing to reinstate for years and years and years. And all of a sudden, it seems like there's pretty wide support from both parties. Betsy DeVos herself has publicly supported the idea. She's continued a pilot program around this that was started under the Obama administration. There's a proposal in the Higher Education Act in the House right now that would reinstate Pell eligibility for incarcerated students. So that seems like this is an area where if lawmakers on both sides are going to get something done, this is one where it might actually happen. We've seen also some agreement over simplification of the FAFSA form. There was a bill recently signed and became law that will eliminate up to 22 questions on the form. And there's, I think, some desire to further simplify that form for students and families to make it easier to apply for aid, which gets back to the idea of sort of what's fair and how to promote equity among students across the country.
We're talking with Collin Binkley of the Associated Press about what's ahead on the higher education beat in 2020. In our prior episode of EWA Radio, we spoke with Mariah Balingit of the Washington Post about the K-12 side of the New Year equation. Look for that in your podcasting queue. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. Collin, I want to turn now to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is considering a challenge of President Trump's decision to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that's left hundreds of thousands of individuals at risk of deportation when their existing permits expire. Princeton University is among those entities seeking to reinstate that program. What's happening right now on college campuses while they wait for that decision?
I'm sure it's tense on college campuses, especially those in areas that may have higher numbers of undocumented students. I'm thinking particularly about California and Texas. Right now we've seen a lot of schools coming out very strongly in support for undocumented students. So I think a lot of them are focusing on making sure that students know that they'll do everything they can to protect them and to support them regardless of the decision. But we've seen just dozens and dozens of schools, I think more than 100, that have submitted briefs to the Supreme Court saying that it's very important to continue this program. They make the argument that these are some of the best students on their campuses, some of the hardest working students on their campuses, and that withdrawing DACA would have really, really severe consequences for universities across the country, not only losing good students and students that contribute to the diversity of the campus, but there are also more bottom line questions to consider. Schools have devoted a lot of resources in recent years to help support these students on campus, and a lot of them are midway through programs. So if they had to withdraw suddenly, over fear of deportation or because they couldn't get aid in certain states, schools could actually be hurt financially out of this deal. And so I'm starting to see more schools respond. I think behind the scenes, there are probably other things happening. Some schools have, in past years established entire centers to help these students, and those are probably really busy right now. And I think students are trying to help provide legal support and legal advice to DACA students so they know what may happen and what their options are. And I think some schools also are starting to increase scholarship fundraising, which could help these students if they're in a state where they would no longer be eligible for state aid if they lose their DACA status.
This feels like a story where a higher education reporter with a little bit of planning could really get ahead of the curve in terms of if you haven't started building those relationships with some of those advocacy organizations and activists, now's the time to do it and start making some connections at your local colleges and universities with students who are DACA recipients, obviously rather than waiting until that decision is handed down.
Absolutely. I think now is the time to do this, in particular, because now is when a lot of the preparation, is taking place. And once there is a decision, they're going to have a lot on their minds beyond talking to reporters in some cases. So I think now would be a great time to go, especially to advocates, but colleges and universities and offices or administrators that focus on helping these students and see what they're doing right now and sort of how students are feeling about this.
Well, Collin, right now the headlines are consumed with some issues related to the United States relations with Iran. You've been writing a little bit about what the coming year might mean for international student enrollment. What should we be watching for?
I think we need to be watching out for any difficulties that students from abroad have in coming to the United States. We've already seen that start to play out. In particular, students from China have had a lot of trouble in recent years amid a trade war with the United States. And even recently, before tensions really ratcheted up between the U.S. and Iran, there was already a petition from dozens of students from Iran saying they were having trouble getting into the United States, having visa issues. And so it's going to be important to see whether those types of issues continue, whether visas are being issued at the same rate and from the same countries. And the flip side of that is whether schools can continue to attract students from abroad, and in particular from some of these countries, as there are tensions. This has been a storyline that we've seen play out for several years, diminishing rate of growth of students coming from China. And that has a real impact on college programs, especially master's programs that have been sort of built with a reliance on students from China and other countries. So it'll be important to see both students who are trying to get here, and then also schools that are trying to maintain diversity of their campus and also, protect the bottom line. These are students who tend to pay full tuition rates and are important to school budgets. So, any sort of significant change in international student trends is likely to have a real impact.
I do want to talk about an investigation you've been working on for some time now, and that is looking at where some of that outside money is coming from, is specifically big name donations to campuses from family foundations. Talk to us a little bit about what you've been reporting on the Sackler Family Foundation.
Sure. A colleague of mine, Jennifer McDermott, we were interested in looking at and trying to find out if we could see where the Sackler family and its foundations were providing money to universities. We know that the family has been a major power in philanthropy in the United States for decades. And, there had already been lots written about some particular schools that have gotten donations from the Sackler family in recent years. And they've faced a lot of criticism over their alleged role in the opioid crisis. And so we were trying to sort of trace the money and see where they've given. So we were able to find out that over the last 5 years or so, that the family had given millions and millions of dollars to prestigious universities around the country, in some cases even after it was well known that they were associated with the opioid crisis. So I think that's something that will continue over the next year as well. I think there's more attention than ever being paid to where universities are getting their money. That's another area where intrepid reporters can go and sort of follow the money back to where it comes from and see who's supporting your universities.
Okay, so if I'm a new reporter or one who just hasn't taken this road before, where do I start? How do I find those figures and names?
It can be a little tricky, but there are a few places that are always good to start. For the Sackler family story that we ended up writing, actually one of the small kernels that got us started down this path was a sort of donor honor roll at Brown University. And it listed a donation, or at least it listed that members of the Sackler family had donated, and that got us interested. So some universities have these types of rosters of donors, not all, and even those don't list all donors necessarily. To get more information, I try to dig through IRS Form 990s that schools are required to file with the IRS. It tends to have donations that schools get and receive, sometimes the ones that they receive. And then also just going to a particular foundation in question. So once we knew that we wanted to look at the Sackler Family Foundations, I compiled a list of all Sackler Family Foundations and then went to their Form 990s. And you can see all giving to outside companies. And so that's where we really started to see at a few foundations in particular, lots of universities listed and also amounts of donations. And then you can go back to schools and confirm that. So those are primarily the best ways where it's going to bear fruit. Universities don't always have to tell you who provides gifts. There are some exceptions to public information laws, so it's not something you can just FOIA so quickly. But there are some ways that you can get a glimpse of who's giving.
We've covered a lot of ground. What have we left out? What are some other story ideas you want to make sure people are thinking about as we head into 2020?
One of the big ones that I wanted to throw out, in fact, was that story on dirty money. I think now would be a great time to go and ask schools around the corner, not only take a look at where the money's coming from, but also ask how they are prepared to handle some of these disputes that may come up about funding. Part of that story is that a lot of schools have been sort of caught off guard by this. They may not have clear policies deciding which donations are acceptable when a person is persona non grata, when it's no longer okay to take money from somebody. So one of the results of all of this, we've seen it in funding from the Sackler family. We've seen it in some funding disputes over money that came from Jeffrey Epstein, is that they're creating boards to help make these decisions. They're trying to establish policies to make it clear both to donors and the university and the public when they will and will not accept money from someone. You could go to any university right now and say, where are you in this process? What would you do if you had something like this? And then also try to follow the money and trace it back and see who's providing support.
An important topic for you in recent years has been looking at issues related to student mental health. What should reporters be thinking about as we head into the new year?
I think that's another one of those stories that's only going to continue to be more important on campuses across the country. A few months ago, I reported a story with some data sort of looking at in some cases, what some might say is a crisis on college campuses for college counseling. More students than ever are going to their counseling centers asking for help, which everyone sort of universally agrees is great. It's good that they're getting help. it's good that they feel comfortable asking for it. But there are questions about whether universities have the capacity to help everyone who comes, and should they? Should they be full-fledged mental health centers? So I think one question that any reporter could go to a college right now and ask is how many college counselors they have, how many mental health counselors they have on campus, and whether they're adding more, whether they're expanding their counseling centers, average wait times, how long are students typically waiting to get help, and is that okay? And then one of the big questions that anyone should ask is how schools are measuring success. How do they think that they're doing a good job? There are some limited metrics out there that schools have used in the past. For example, some recommendations on counselor to student ratios, but some of those are starting to be seen as a bit outdated. So schools are rethinking now, what is the best way to serve students and how do we measure if we're doing it well? So I think now is a good time to jump into that debate and see how schools are answering it.
Have you set any New Year's resolutions for yourself, either personal you're willing to share or professional?
I have a couple. One is pretty hard as a reporter, but I'm trying to spend less time on my phone, or at least spend less time mindlessly scrolling through Twitter, which is something I do far too often. And then another one, maybe a little more concrete, I'm going to try to run more miles than I drive this year, which I think is doable, but I've never actually measured, so we'll see.
Well, since you're joining us from the Associated Press's office in Boston, I would say maybe wait a couple months to set off on that goal.
Oh, this is my favorite time of the year to run, actually. I love it.
Collin Binkley covers higher education for the Associated Press and was kind enough to join us. Collin, thank you.
Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.